So today on the bench we have a set of 3-liter turbo heads. These heads have actually been done once before already. We pulled these off an engine that had been rebuilt but was leaking oil everywhere. I've pulled 3 heads down, and the guides are really loose on the exhaust side and borderline on the intake side. So we're going to go and replace at least the exhaust guides, possibly the intakes, but right now I'm just going to get everything cleaned up. I expect to be able to reuse valves, springs, all of that good stuff. It's just the guides that are an issue. These heads have already been machined here, so we need to establish what size they are and just kind of get a baseline. So when we put this engine together, they're stamped 10,000, so I'm assuming they've been machined 0.25 of a millimeter already. Okay, so I'm just looking at the valve spring pressure for our seat pressure, and I'm looking for around 30 to 40 pounds of seat pressure. I've set the valve spring tester at our installed height, which for a turbo is 33.5 millimeters, and we're just under 40 psi on this one. I'll go through and check them all once I've cleaned them because I don't want to make my machine oily, but at a first look, looks like they're probably okay for valve springs. All right, so I have cleaned up all of my heads, all of my valves, all of my springs, and gone through and taken some measurements. It's almost redoing other people's work is so much more work because I got to go through and I can't just take assumptions. So normally on a set of heads, if I have one valve that is worn out, I know that the other 5 are going to be worn out. So it saves me a little bit of time here. So with this one, I've gone through, checked every single valve spring. Other than there's some minor surface corrosion, which I'm not a big fan of, I'll throw these in the polisher. As long as there's no pits, these come up to minimum pressure specs and we'll be fine. The valves. So I have cleaned up all of our valves and measured all of our valves. These ones are all within spec, but this valve has no brand markings on it anywhere that I can find. There's nothing. Normally there's a brand that's laser etched in here or a Porsche part number if they're a factory original. Have no idea what the brand is. These 4 intakes and these 4 exhausts do come up within factory's tolerances for stem size, and margin looks okay. These 4, I have 2 exhausts and 2 intakes that are under the acceptable size limit. So we're going to have to buy 2 exhaust valves and 2 intake valves. So with the valve guides and showing that you always need to check everything, I have my go gauge. This is a 9mm pin, which should slide in nicely, and it doesn't. It'll start to go into the guide, but then locks up pretty quickly. And that's pretty much the same on all but one cylinder, where it would actually go in and it actually slide down like it should do. This one is the intake. So this intake was actually sized correctly. And then if I take my maximum size pin gauge there, too tight, won't go in. So this one is maximum. It's not a no-go. It's still usable, but ideally we want to be hitting right at that 9mm. This is a 9.015 pin, and that will not go in. But all of the other valve guides won't even take a 9mm pin. It will start and then locks up. And what that means is when this was honed or sized after they installed new guides, the valve, when it goes into the cylinder head, squishes around that guide area, and they either push through too fast and it just belled out on each end, and the centers are too tight, and being a turbo application, that's not a good thing. It means things are going to get bound up when this thing gets hot. So to fix it, we're not actually going to replace them. I'm going to go ream every single valve guide, re-hone every single valve guide, replace our valves with undersized stems, which explains why when I grabbed them, and I was just lucky that I grabbed the one that was undersized, I had more slop than I should have had. Lastly, these heads have been stamped 010, which is usually standing for 10 thousandths. even though this is a metric car. I usually like to stamp in metric. However, I went and I measured the thickness on every single cylinder head. And I've written the sizes here. So these three heads, well within the 0.05 range as far as head to head. Problem is, these are not 10 thousandths under, they're closer to 20 thousandths under, or half a millimeter. These heads should measure 84.5 millimeters from new. When you machine 0.25 mil, which is 10 thousandths, that'll bring them down to 84.22, 84.24, depending on what they started at. So this car was running with a higher compression. I know it just had standard base shims under the barrels. This is very important when you're setting up stuff, that it's hard these days to go off of this stamp just because this thing's so old. You don't know how many sets of hands it's been through and what's been done. So the good thing is at least the whole set is matching. And these ones here, 83.953, 954, and 945, well within the tolerance range of head to head. Even if I mixed one up onto here, this one, it would still be in the tolerance range, although it's getting up there a little bit higher. So the long and the short of it is, got to do a lot of work just to rework some things, clean some things up, clean up the guides, get some new valves. I did do a pattern test on the valve, and we'll show you the results of that in just a second. Okay, so what I'm looking at here is two things. One, the width of the seat.
It's very small.
Which is actually too big.
Why?
It should be 1.5.
Hmm.
And we're actually a little bit bigger. We're closer to 1.7. The other thing that I'm looking at is the position on the valve. And ideally, I want a little bit of space. If I wipe this off, you can see we're right on the edge of the valve. Ideally, I usually like to get my seat in the middle of this area. And my only problem with adjusting that is how much room I have available. So I take my installed height gauge, and with this we have a maximum installed height of 46 millimeters. My dial gauge is set to 46. Right now we're negative 0.14. An average cut to close a seat is going to be from 0.3 to maybe 0.4 of a millimeter, depending on the seat. So that's actually going to put me really close to being the valve extended too far up into the cam area. The only way to resolve that would be to replace the seats after that. So I'm going to have to play with it a little bit, see if I can get it to clean up, and I'll probably just do it by hand instead of using our usual seat cutting equipment, and see if I can make a better pattern for it, close the seat down. I've just got to be really careful that I don't exceed that height, otherwise we're going to create a lot more work. So I'm also going to do the same for the exhaust valves. We can see a slight imprint on the valve where it's been running, and it already looks like it's doing the same as the intakes, which means they've cut the seat too big. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is just take a look at my installed height. This one's even closer. It's 0.08 of a millimeter. I can go to plus 0.3 as maximum, so it's not giving me a lot of room to work. And then if we take a look at our seat, same thing. It's a little bit better than the intake. Just going to wipe a little bit of that off. Still really close to the edge of the valve. And if we take a look at our seat width, it's actually a little better than the intakes. It's 0.6 of 1.6 millimeters. Usually we're looking for 1.5, so 1.6 is acceptable. So the long and the short, we have some work in front of us to get these things cleaned up, and looking a little better. Not the end of the world, but definitely seeing a lot of life and a lot of machine work. Okay, so I've just finished honing and reaming all of our valve guides, and I'm just checking my finish down there. And so far everything's come up really nice. It's kind of hard to see in the camera. But my next steps now is I'll reface the valves that we're going to reuse. I've ordered some new valves, some new exhaust valves. Intake valves are turning out to be a little bit of a problem. Seems that nobody has any in stock, so I may have to go looking a little further for those. So we're going to dress our valve seats. I've done 2 already, and this is kind of what we're looking for. I just want to take off as little as I possibly can. So just starting to cut the exhaust valve, you can see where the seat's just barely contacting the stone. And so our face across here is not 45 degrees. And then after we finish grinding it, we're coming all the way out to the margin. Still a couple of spots right there where I could use a little bit more. So I just finished machining all of the seats as little as I possibly could. Unfortunately, I couldn't leave them the way they were, where they were seating on the intake valve. I'll pop this one out. This one I've relapped. I normally don't lap valves, but because these are a used valve on 4 of them, I'm using a little bit of lapping paste. But initially when I lapped it, half the seat was hanging off the end of the valve. So I had to set my seat cutter in as tight as I could, not having that much room to really cut, and recut. And then when I lapped, I was able to get it to where there's a little bit of clearance right there. Still maintained my seat width. But now I'm going to number each valve because each valve is going to be lapped to a particular cylinder. I'll run along and lap all my intake valves, and then I'll do the same on my exhausts. So we've got a nice consistent finish all the way around. Still got some space between the margin. Still, I'd like to see it further out, but I just measured all of my installed heights, and there's no way I could shrink this seat in. I'm landing right at just positive of 46 millimeters right now. The spec is 46 plus 0.3, so I'm still well within the Porsche factory range for not having to change the seats, but this will definitely be the last time that these seats are cut. They'll have to be replaced if the heads ever come off again. So I have the same problem with the exhaust valves where the seat is too close to the margin, and on this one the seat's actually about 2 millimeters wide. It should be 1.5. So I'm going to do the same on this, recut the exhaust seats, cut as little as I possibly can off of them, but just to move it up the valve, get a better pattern in a better location, and get a better seal with a slightly narrower seat dimension. Okay, so I've cut all of the exhaust valve seats. I'll pop one out so you can kind of sort of see it. And got everything in there. I haven't lapped these yet. I'll do that in just a minute. But what I wanted to do first is check my installed heights and make sure we're still there. This one's right just 0.0203 under where it should be. All the rest came up pretty nice, all around about the same kind of number. This one's negative 0.17. This one was the closest. It came right up onto my tolerance. where it's right at 0.3 above its installed height. So still good to use, but as on the intakes, this is going to be the last seat cut that these will get. The next service, these will have to have the intakes and exhaust seats replaced. Okay, so I finished all the valve work and I was doing what I thought was going to be something really quick, and that was just looking at some of the studs, and this kind of proves that you can't really pass over anything. So on this particular hole, somebody had already time certed it, and I'm going to show you the stud. The time cert wasn't seated all the way, and then when I thought, oh well, I'll just pull the thing out and see if I can reseat it or pull it out and replace it. Well, it turns out it was more of a mess than it really should have been. The hole wasn't drilled deep enough. There was a piece of broken bolt left in the bottom of the hole, so they couldn't tap it far enough, so they just screwed it down until it stopped, and that's where they left it. It kind of belled open the top here. I'm not too worried about that because I was able to get a good bite and machine about 14 millimeters down into good material once I got the broken bolt out. And I'll put a much deeper time cert down in there that'll grab right at the bottom. The other issue I found on one of the other heads was the stud wasn't seated, and when I pulled it out, the stud was bent. I thought, well, okay, got dropped or damaged. But then when I screwed the new stud into it, the stud was all off at an angle. So I see why the stud got bent. Instead of fixing the problem with the hole, they just hit the stud with a hammer to bend it over so they could get the exhaust on. So it really shows you can't overlook anything on these. What I thought would be 5 minutes has turned into an hour and a half with getting broken pieces out, re-time certing. I've still got the other head to do, and then hopefully we can move on to assembly. Okay, so the next one I'm going to fix is that bent hole. Right now, this is what the stud looks like. I just stuck the new one in. Top of the threads are also belled out, and the stud that came out of it, you can see the bend right here in it, where they had just like, oh yeah, it's bent over like this, we'll just bang it over this direction. Also the bottom of the threads are rolled over. It looks like there's something stuck down in the hole, like maybe a broken bolt. So fixing these by hand is really, really tough. That's why I use my mill. These already have the studs out on the intake, so the intakes are nice and flat. I can get them trued up into my vise and sitting nice and straight, held securely. I'm using a really short drill that doesn't have much flex into it. If you use a long drill, it'll tend to follow the hole. So it takes a combination of things to make them right. So we're at final assembly stage. This is my chance to go over everything one last time. So I've cleaned all the threads on the studs, get silicone out, make sure there's no nicks when I'm putting the thing back together. Inside I've cleaned everything, brake cleaned it, aired it all off, final check over my exhaust studs, my threads for my intake studs. We're waiting on new studs for these heads, that's why they're not on, and normally when I'm working on turbos I remove them because the studs are out here. So now we're just setting up spring height. So I've got my valve that's numbered to this cylinder. Push it in, no lube or anything right now. And I've already done 3 heads, so I got a pretty good idea what my starting package is going to be. And on this one, there's a combination of things going on. The turbos run a lower installed, or it's a closer installed height. It's 33.5 millimeters versus the most other 911 heads of 34.5 to 35.5. So there's a couple of things with shims that I'm adding because A, the valves are being cut, C, the seats are being cut, so that's moved everything this direction. We still need to confirm what our installed height is because we've checked our spring pressure at that. So it's going to take a few more shims, which is not an issue. Okay, so on my installed height, this is 35.5, this is 34.5, this secondary mark down here is 33.5, so we're right on our installed height. So now I'm going to pull that out, put the valve stem seal on, and install the valve. Okay, valve stem seal. valve. Sure our valve springs are installed the correct direction. I'm just going to seat it. So it's going to continue to do the same on the exhaust valve. The exhaust installed height's the same as the intakes, so the process is identical. And the same with the last two heads. We'll get those finished up. Then all we've got left to do is install our intake studs, which we're waiting for new ones, and then we're going to wrap these heads up. These are for an engine that we're currently doing, waiting for the case to come back from the machine shop from a close and hone. So we're just trying to get ahead of things, so once all of our parts are here, we can go ahead and assemble this without having to stop and wait. Okay, so the last part of this job is installing the studs, and turbos are unique in that it's a 120 millimeter stud, and it's quite long to work with. So that's all 6 heads. I'm just going to lubricate our valve springs because we're still waiting on our crankcase to come back from the machine shop. And we'll clean all of these again before we go to install them. And to make sure they stay clean, just going to bag these to put them onto the shelf while we wait for the rest of the engine to come back.